right, so if you want a copy of this slide deck, you can use the QR code at the front of the screen. And also, for those who can't quite get the QR code to work, I have a URL, http://bit.ly/vendor A11Y. That will give you a PDF version of these slides, and it should be accessible, but if there are accessibility issues, just let me know. All right, so today we're going to be talking about designing a vendor monitoring program. And a little bit about Navy Federal, where I work. We have a commitment to serve all of our members, and that means providing equal access to our products and services. And so a little about me. First, just to describe what I look like. I am a tall woman with blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black and gray dress that can only be described as a cross between a school teacher and a librarian. And I have glasses. But I joined Navy Federal in 2020, and I currently work as the ADA Digital Program Manager, leading our enterprise technical accessibility team. I chair the Accessibility Allies Committee of Practice and represent NFCU on the W3C accessibility guidelines and ARIA working groups, and I'm also a member of the Internet Society's Special Interest Group. And this is our team here at Navy Federal. We have two of our team members here today at LATO. If you want to stand up, they're here today. These are the best and brightest. Please don't steal them. So everything in this slide deck is a resource. We're not going to get through all of the slides today, and we probably won't get through all the content, but please take these slides and use them however you'd like to. You can just erase my name and slap your own on there. If you do, I suggest you sub out the picture unless you want to get a blonde wig. I mean, your choice. Choose your own adventure. And note that the opinions expressed here are not the opinions of Navy Federal. They're just my opinions. Also, I am a lawyer, but this is not legal advice. Not that this is really going to help you, having legal advice from an American attorney, but, also, nothing here is an attorney-client relationship. I'm looking at you in the back. All right, so first, building a case for a vendor program. So why do you need a vendor program? Well, when you use vendor products, many times a customer can't tell where your product ends and the vendor product begins. So vendor claims need to be validated. If they're saying that they're accessible, you want to make sure that they provide the same level of accessibility as the experience that you want to provide to your consumers. Also, accessibility experts really need to be part of the procurement process. Because when accessibility is everyone's responsibility, like if you designate procurement professionals and say, your job is accessibility, it suddenly becomes no one's responsibility. And then also relying on outside vendors to provide all of your accessibility functions, which is a tactic a lot of companies do, is costly and is also not sustainable. So, and accessibility risk factors are different than other risks weighed by an organization. Also, just another side note, you can't have a diverse workforce if you don't purchase accessible products. So really just making sure you're procuring the right tools can help ensure meet your diversity and equity initiatives as well. So you've heard all the different business cases. I'll just quickly go through them. You have the business case. People with disabilities represent a $490 billion market. You also have the ethical case. It's just the right thing to do because access to ICT and the internet is a human right. You have the financial case. Finding issues have gone to production is pretty costly. The legal case, it's against the law in a lot of places to have an inaccessible experience available to your customers. What folks don't realize is also it's discriminatory to have inaccessible tools and such that employees are required to use. Let's say like the intranet and such. That's something that people tend to forget. There's also the human case. We all will likely develop a disability, if you don't already have one, at some point in our lives. So we're really just making things accessible for the future versions of ourselves. And so when you're making these cases and such, you're going to find that you'll have to make the same case in a lot of different ways to a lot of different people. And it can get exhausting, but the important thing is to be patient and to never give up. And if you can't persuade leadership, do the program anyways. Start small. Convince one other person in your organization that accessibility is the right thing to do and accessible procurement is the right way to go. Have that person convince another person. And over time, the people that begin to understand the importance of accessibility begins to multiply. And really, when you look at it, a company's culture is comprised of the contributions and beliefs of each employee. So if you change somebody's mind, then you're beginning to change a culture. And really, at the end of the day, we don't go to work, just to get a paycheck. We all would find higher paying jobs if that were the case. We go to work because we want to do the right thing and we want to make a difference. And that's true of all your colleagues as well. And if you show them how accessibility really makes a difference in people's lives, they'll want to follow you. It takes time to do this, to actually get that buy-in at the grassroots level, but it does work. So how do you build your program? Here's some steps. They're not in order for building your vendor program. You have to assemble your team, form your relationships. Those are key to getting things done. Determine your program scope. Inventory your vendor applications. Develop your accessible procurement policy. Write accessibility contract language. Develop a robust process, which we'll go over soon. Include people with disabilities in that process. And of course, be clear about how you outline the role for your accessibility team. So why you need an accessibility vendor team? You need accessibility subject matter expertise. These folks will be charged with building relationships with procurement departments and vendors and building credibility for your program. They also assist procurement with tasks related to accessibility and draft accessibility template language, which is going to be key because a lot of procurement departments don't have that skill set. They maintain key documentation. You'd actually be very surprised with how many procurement departments don't quite have a handle on their contracts. And they assess accessibility level and risk, which you need qualified experts to do. So who's on that team? You would have a relationship manager. That's somebody who works well with different teams and who's good at finding solutions. A contract manager. So that's going to be somebody with program management expertise and experience with more legal and risk-based aspects who can field questions from risk teams, legal, and assist procurement in drafting provisions. And then you have accessibility engineers that perform more of the engineering function, so helping people perform audits, remediation, et cetera. What you don't want to do is you don't want to try to find somebody who can do everything, because that's just impossible. So relationships are everything in this process. And it's going to be very difficult to build those relationships at first because people are going to ask, well, who are you? And why are you here? So training and awareness efforts go a long way in helping explain the importance of accessibility to procurement teams and why it's important to include accessibility experts and people with disabilities in that process. So if you can't get officially integrated in the procurement process, focus on building those individual relationships. Make friends with folks in the procurement department. Start getting those contracts. help them with their work and try to make their lives easier. So if you have a good set of vendor documentation, you can just provide that to the procurement department when you have to work with certain vendors and such. And it really does go a long way to help them and help build your credibility. So try to also get access to your company's contract management system so you can actually get those contracts. And then do what you can to actually help out with those negotiations and try to stay on top of where vendors are in their process. So building strong working relationships is important and makes it easier for you to advocate for your team and have the support of others. So some of the departments that you should be building relationships with are not only procurement, but also your risk teams, cybersecurity, and legal teams. So they all have similar goals, and they don't often realize the technical part of accessibility is different than the legal part. And so you can actually help them understand that and kind of build your own little niche. So how do you define scope? This is actually a decision tree that I've used to help train procurement folks on the scope of accessibility, because they don't understand, when we're talking about an application, what do we really mean? So if you're just focused on customer or public facing, it's things like portals, web pages, digital documents and such, e-learning, communication tools, surveys, emails, native mobile apps, et cetera, that are customer or public facing. So there's a good distinction there, because if it's behind an authenticated wall, it still has to be accessible because it's customer facing. Now, looking at this as well, you also want to take a look at your internal applications and determine scope there. So obviously, the greatest risk is public-facing, but also what's a big risk is internal-facing applications. I would focus on training and intranets and such, things that people have to use to do their jobs. So it's important to know all public-facing vendors and the important internal-facing vendors that your organization works with, and ensure those are accessible. So relationships will help you connect the dots there. So as I mentioned earlier, building your own database of vendors really helps. So when you're doing this database, you should include things like last accessibility audit date and results, documentation of accessibility fixes, their accessibility conformance report, or ACR, if available, internal point of contact, and then public information such as links to their accessibility policy and public-facing examples. Now, the reason why you need links to public-facing examples is because you might have to test their application, and you might not get that information from the vendor, and you should just test them anyways. Note what kind of vendor it is and classify that. Some vendors may provide functionality, for instance, or others might provide services that allow you that create content that creates functionality that's available to the public. And those require different kinds of contract provisions. And of course, obviously, always get the latest vendor contract. So work with teams that are already inventorying vendors for other reasons. There are probably folks in your company right now that are trying to tackle the same problem. So you should try to become friends with them and find ways to work together. So contact different departments or business units also directly to attain the vendors that they use and help them use that to build your database. So you can actually just send emails even to managers of different divisions and such. You don't need permission to do it, just go ahead. And then provide ways for different teams across the organization to report vendors and ask for accessibility reviews. So you can actually build that process out in your company's intranet and say, well, do you have a vendor? Do you want an accessibility review? And as you're training in awareness campaigns and such, build awareness about your program to your organization, you'll find that more people will start using that system and start looping you in. So another thing you can do is you can just do it on your own too and search the web for all public company links, inspect the code to find clues that they're using vendor technology. That's a great way to find vendors. Shadow other teams Don't tell them that you're doing it for this purpose if that's going to be a problem. To figure out how each product is developed and what they're using, and ask your procurement friends. So you should also have a policy around accessible procurement, which should include things like the statement of the organization's commitment to accessibility, a level of conformance, relevant law. Supplier codes of conduct are great. You can include accessibility resources in them. Everybody should have them, and you should include them in their accessibility policies. Scope. That scope with those examples that I had would be very helpful to include in your supplier code of conduct. Responsible team or party would be helpful for the policy. Remediation and monitoring processes and consequences and failure to adhere to the policies, as well as an exceptions process. And note that exceptions should always be temporary and should be very rarely used. So contract provisions should include level of conformance required, when testing will be performed and by whom. This is important because you want to shift as many costs as you can to the vendor, because they're ultimately really responsible for their own accessibility. And then define when those tests should be occurring, which includes after major releases or after a certain time has passed. Who will perform testing? You should always include people with disabilities in this. How testing will be performed, etc. Have different templates for different services. Here is a list of examples. You can find that in the slide deck as well. So contracts for staff augmentation are going to have different provisions than services to create digital content. Different contract provisions are going to be needed for web and mobile applications and platforms, documents, etc. And the role of the accessibility team should be assisting with securing accessible vendors. So they serve both the procurement team and the department making the purchase to kind of help find those vendors, help assess their levels of accessibility, and then maintain appropriate documentation and such. They also help with drafting accessibility requirements, reviewing VPATs or ACRs, performing pre-selection reviews and such, suggesting the best vendors, performing audits, training, etc. So here's an overview of a process that you can use in your own vendor monitoring program. The process would begin with at the requirement level. So you want to shift left, kind of like everything else in accessibility. Your accessible procurement process will want to start as far left as possible. At the point where a business unit says that they need a new technology or needs to onboard a new vendor. Then you help with sourcing at the request for proposal stage with language and such for that verification, contract, monitoring, and then renewal. So start at the source and the requirement phase. So you have to understand that the team, you'll have to help the team procuring the technology understand the importance of accessibility. And then build places in your process where your accessibility team is informed of new vendor requests. Let your vendors know about your accessibility process and policy. That's key to helping build those good relationships. Add your accessibility questionnaire to your RFP template if your organization uses one. As I mentioned earlier, supplier codes of conduct are great. And if you can do so, publicly post your accessibility policy publicly so that folks understand your organization's level of commitment. So a little bit about VPATs. VPATs are the form. It's the blank template vendors can use to show that their products are accessible. It's used for things like Section 508. There's a couple of resources on this particular slide where you can actually learn more about the VPAT, whereas the ACR is the completed VPAT. An ACR, an accessibility conformance report, does not have to be a VPAT, but often is. So if you have a blank VPAT and you fill it out, that becomes an ACR. So usually vendors provide them as part of the procurement process to show their level of accessibility. And so make sure that the ACR that you're looking at actually is about the product and functionality you're about to use. It's important to actually verify all ACRs because there are not lies, but stretching of truths. So review vendor claims. So things that make them more reliable. I've, in the past, required that they be based on an assessment done by a qualified, reputable, independent third party, and that the tester name is provided and they have a known certification in the industry. That also makes it more reliable. Certifications are not everything, but if, in the absence of any more information, they do kind of help. The testing and test tools and process that they used, detailed information such as unresolved issues. Also, look at the date because there are a lot of ACRs out there that were completed based on audits that were completed a long time ago. So it's just important to verify that it's based on an audit, that the audit happened recently, and by a reputable independent source. So they have to be, they should be based on a full audit of the product. And the reason why you want to require that is many internal teams don't have qualified accessibility engineers. And if the ACR provided does not meet your standards, you should really provide or commission a full audit. Since most of the internet is inaccessible, it's likely that the vendor you're working with will also have an inaccessible product. So plan accordingly. And a vendor should never be considered compliant unless a full audit was performed by somebody who is qualified, reputable, from an independent third party, or your own team if you have those resources. And all findings that were found in that audit have been fixed, or that there were no findings, and validated by the auditor in writing. And that's going to be your documentation for later. Smoke testing. Now this is something that many procurement toolkits don't have. But smoke tests should be part of your monitoring strategy. This is how you make sure that when somebody updates something, even if it's not a major update, or every so often, you're going in and just verifying that they didn't break the accessibility of their product. So prior to selection is when you should do your first smoke testing, and that's to help you choose the most accessible vendor out of a list of choices. So smoke testing is light accessibility testing that's time-boxed. That can be done to the vendor's application's most critical workflows. And it can include things like screen reader tests, keyboard testing, color contrast, an automated scan, manual check of the code. It's very fast. That'll help you just get a general gut check of the level of accessibility of the application that you're looking at. And so even if a vendor has an excellent response to an RFP, if they're providing technology or digital content, smoke testing should be performed. And the vendor should be notified about the review and informed of any results. And they should know it's not a full audit, just a cursory review, and so that they don't come back and say, well, hey, we fixed the findings and we're all done now. Smoke test exemptions could be provided, but they should only be provided if the vendor provides an ACR that meets your standards. So one that is done by a reputable independent third party. So let your vendors know how important accessibility is to your organization and the human impact of that work. That's going to be very important for building rapport with your vendors. You want to treat your vendors like your partners, because really you're in this together to make accessible products. Because vendors generally don't want to sell products that exclude people. And so come at them with a place of understanding, from a place of understanding. They just want to be able to do the right thing and provide you with a service that meets your expectations and meets your needs. And so accessibility is relatively new and chances are your vendor probably doesn't know how to make sure that their products are accessible, and maybe they haven't established a culture of accessibility at the organization, so they might just need help. So be reasonable and solutions-oriented. Hold vendors accountable, be firm, push them where they need to go, and just be understanding that most vendors will need to fix something, and help them maintain compliance over your relationship. As I mentioned earlier, monitoring plans are very important, and they should consider everything you learned in the procurement process about the vendor, and they should be unique and tailored to each vendor. And they should be recorded and included within your vendor documentation. And if the vendor is compliant at the time of the contract begins, monitoring should consist of periodic smoke testing based on your vendor risk score. And periodically, you should perform full audits just as a matter of course. If the vendor's not compliant, get them to agree to a compliance roadmap, and then create your monitoring plan after they've reached compliance. This can get kind of costly to do at scale. So, that's why it's important to try to shift as many costs to the vendor as possible, and then also try to bring your auditing in-house. Just relying on, the different consulting companies to do all of your auditing is not a sustainable model for the future. So when to re-audit? So assuming an audit was performed pre-selection or just after selection, vendors should be re-audited when there's been a major change or update to a product, when the vendor has higher critical issues found as part of a smoke test, once every 12 to 18 months, any vendor that is otherwise found in breach, at contract renewal as well if an audit hasn't been performed previously. So you'll find that when you create your audit database and such, you'll still get lots of new vendors over time. And you'll only find out about them during contract renewal. That's true with any large organization. And you'll just have to plan for that. So each company will have their own risk scoring model, and it's going to be based on factors like the size of your program, number of vendors, impact of those vendors, how many customers use their products and such. And vendors deemed high risk should be prioritized for audits and smoke testing over lower risk vendors. So as I mentioned earlier, expect and plan for non-conformance. Learn the extent of non-conformance by performing an audit or asking the vendor to commission one. Address non-conformance in a conversation with the vendor and your internal stakeholders. Get leadership involved if you need to. And the role of the accessibility team at this point is to really provide clear remediation guidance. Help them fix the issue. And make sure you provide actual code that they can use to help make those fixes. At this point, you're really partners. And if the product team isn't responding, figure out who the accessibility people in the organization are and use that as leverage to help you get those findings fixed. Often, it'll be people in this room probably, and they'll be more than willing to help you push the product teams in the right direction. In many organizations, the product teams are separate from the accessibility team, and their job is to push product teams to do what's right. So with that, you'll want to include a written remediation timeline. You'll want to get the vendor to agree to that, and never consider anything fixed unless the fix is validated and accepted by the auditor. This is really important because a lot of people end up saying, oh yeah, I fixed the issue. And you find, no, you didn't fix the issue, or you broke it even more. So get those validated. And once everything's verified, then they're okay until their next smoke test. Breach and escalation. There will be times that a vendor will refuse to allow an independent auditor audit their functionality or refuse to provide documentation that meets your standards. And this is where you need a clear breach and escalation process. And you need to have leadership involved in that. If you can't get the top leadership, get your middle managers, get your VPs involved because they often own those relationships. Also, be sure to know your vendor's contract, especially in this particular case, because then you can help inform your procurement teams about what the vendor's obligations are, or whether you have to kind of use soft power to kind of help them move in the right direction. Create contingency plans. Contingency plans are really important, especially if you have to terminate the contract. In a contingency plan, you should outline which other vendors provide a similar service and which of those options is more accessible so that you have something to move to in the event you need to terminate a contract. And continue working with the vendor through the process to try to get them to do the right thing. There will be times that you will have to terminate contracts, and you have to be ready to do that. Contingency plans are important. Also, making sure that procurement, legal, and other key stakeholders understand this process and are ready to terminate the contracts. And understand that you might not be able to terminate a contract right away because of the size of the platform or what have you. So be practical and try to find practical solutions that will work and define a time frame. So that's why it's really important to understand as much as you can and learn as much as you can about the vendors and the other options available in the market. Renewals, as I mentioned earlier, this might be the first time you find out about a vendor is through the renewal process. So it's important to actually have a calendar of when renewals are going to take place and make sure you're involved in the conversation. Teams, unless they know you're there and unless you have a really strong leadership buy-in, procurement's unlikely to involve you in all these conversations. So you're going to have to understand and know when these conversations are taking place yourself and reach out to people. So for existing vendors, renewals are a great time to validate accessibility, add accessibility contract language if it's not already in their contract, and then research alternatives as well if the vendor is not compliant or unwilling to work with your team. And then you have accommodations plans. While you're working with a vendor to get them into compliance, it's important that you have a plan in place to make sure all your customers and employees can access services and information. So that's the part where you're planning for non-compliance because the internet is 98% of the internet's inaccessible. So be sure to create comprehensive accommodations plans that allow access, the most access possible until things are fixed. Make sure these plans are temporary and not designed to be replaced, with working functionality. Be creative in your approach. You'll probably need several different options to reach the most people. And be wary of quick and easy solutions that claim to provide access, like overlays. So a comprehensive training and communications program can help you raise awareness across your organization. And it should include things about like why accessibility is important, key laws and regulations, accessibility standards, how those apply to different kinds of content, accessible procurement best practices, and you really ought to be training your procurement teams. And even with this training, that's not going to replace the need for the accessibility expertise that your team provides. It's just to build awareness. Also, get procurement involved in your disability employee resource group. Obviously, make sure any training provided is accessible, but getting them involved there will help show them the human aspect of this and the fact that it's really affecting employees and customers. And if you don't have a training program, I included a link to a presentation a few years ago about our training program. We have a pretty robust one that has curricula and such that you can use to help build your own program. So to wrap up, here's some lessons we learned. Many vendors will want you to tell them about accessibility issues to push them to do what's right. And this is very true of accessibility teams within that vendors have. This process isn't something that's going to take away from your relationship with your vendors. It's actually going to help you strengthen those relationships with your vendors and with people across your organization. If you get pushback, don't take it personally. See it as an opportunity to educate. Also, don't be afraid. Vendors want your money. They're not going to say no to all your money because you want them to be accessible. So be bold. And vendor programs are powerful. If everyone here starts demanding that products be accessible and actually holding vendors accountable, we can actually change the fact that 98% of the internet's inaccessible and start bridging the accessibility or the disability digital divide. Also, tracking metrics and regular reporting are incredibly important to showing value. That's probably one of the first things after you have established your program that you'd want to start doing is figuring out a regular reporting scheme and figuring out the best metrics to track. If you have questions about that, let me know. We developed an excellent metrics tracking system for our vendor program. The following slides have a number of resources, so please use them. Use any of the information you want here. You can just copy and paste if you want. It doesn't matter. If you build great vendor programs because of this presentation, I consider my work done. Know that you're not alone. Learn from others in this space. And in each success that you have helps you make the case to grow and strengthen your program. And changing minds takes time. Just don't give up. So here's some resources for building your own accessibility program. I highly recommend the Disability in Procurement Toolkit. AussieWay also has a lot of great resources as well. And if you haven't joined the Web Alley Slack, there's like a secret chat room where all the accessibility professionals hang out and just talk about things. So I highly recommend that you join it. Section 508 also has a good set of documentation for building your own procurement process. And then someone asked me about hiring for accessibility engineers and such, and writing inclusive job postings. So on this slide are a number of resources to help you do that. If you have any questions at all about what a good hiring process is for hiring engineers, accessibility engineers, just let me know. And here's my contact information. So my email is jaunita_george@navyfederal.org. And you can find me on LinkedIn at https://www.linkedin.com/in/jaunitageorge. And it is Juanita, but spelled wrong. So, all right. Questions?